For AZPM, I'm Tim Swindle, Professor Emeritus of Planetary Science at the University of Arizona, and this is Arizona Science. Joining me today is Diane Thompson, an Associate Professor of Geosciences at the university who has been studying coral reefs to unlock the details of Earth's climate history. Welcome, Diane.
Thanks for having me.
How can you use coral reefs to study climate?
That's a great question. Well, here in Arizona, you're probably familiar with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. Well, it turns out corals are very similar in that they grow in these annual bands that we can actually see by eye. And those bands actually contain information about the ocean conditions at the time the coral is growing. So you might remember the last time you've walked on a beach and picked up a shell off the beach. Well, that shell, just like coral, is made out of a mineral called calcium carbonate. Then those building blocks contain information in the atoms of that molecule about the seawater conditions, the chemistry of the water around it as the coral was growing. So inadvertently, as they're building their skeleton, just like that shell on the beach, they're actually incorporating information about climate conditions around them.
What kind of information are they incorporating? What are the things that you can measure?
Yeah, so one of the big ones we actually looked at in the study is something called water isotopes. And so this is just a way of looking at, again, the chemistry of seawater. And it tells us something about hydroclimate, so the water cycle. And that's a really important target for understanding how climate change is impacting what we really care about, especially a place like here in the Southwest, which is water and water availability. And so in these atoms of oxygen and hydrogen that make up the water molecule, sometimes there's an extra neutron that changes that molecular weight. And in that provides a fingerprint, a signature, a chemical signature, if you will, that we can use to understand changes of the water cycle in the past.
What are some of the things that drive the ratios of the different isotopes in, say, oxygen, one direction or the other?
It's a great question. So we actually can do this with tree rings as well and other types of what we call natural archives of past climate. So these are nature's historians, trees, corals, and they're recording changes in the water cycle. And so coming back to those isotopes, you can think about them as heavier or lighter versions of water. So some have heavier versions of oxygen and heavier isotopes of hydrogen. And that basically makes it harder for them to move around the water cycle. You can imagine if they're heavier, it takes more energy, for example, for them to be evaporated off the surface of the ocean into the atmosphere and eventually fall out as rain on another location. And so basically this accounting of the water molecules through the water cycle is impacted by the molecular weight of that water isotope, that water molecule.
Can you do this just by measuring the coral, or is it measuring the coral combined with something else that is affected by the same process somewhere else?
Yeah, so we really do just look at the skeleton of the coral as one example. And again, this is just one type of nature's historian. So with corals, we basically go in and we take what we call a core sample. So we drill a big, long, you can imagine, core cylindrical sample out of the center of a coral. We split it open, and you can imagine a loaf of bread. We cut it out into little sandwich slices, which we then can sample painstakingly, millimeter by millimeter, down the coral skeleton from the time it grew, its entire history, so sometimes hundreds of years. And each millimeter we painstakingly sample and bring back to the lab. We dissolve it, and we look at the signature of these oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in the lab. And that tells us information about, again, the sort of water cycle, the local sort of salinity in this case of the ocean water, which tells us about changes in the water cycle through time.
You compared coral to tree rings. You said that they're annual growth layers. Now, coral is actually, a reef is made up of a bunch of single animals. Are the annual growth rings, is that like one animal wide, or is it a million, or?
Great question. So many corals and the types that we use for this type of work are colonial organisms. So they do have individual animals that grow together in these large colonies. And together they create these big, massive, it's sometimes as big as, like, imagine a VW bus size colonies that then we take these cores out of. And so those growth bands that I'm referring to are actually coming from this colonial organism. So not these individual animals, but this colony of individual organisms that live together on the reef.
How big is an individual coral polyp?
It depends, but anywhere from millimeter to even sometimes smaller, micron scale. So you can see them by eye, but they are quite small.
If you look and you see a coral reef, is that all live coral, or is it only, say, on the outside that the coral is alive and the rest is just skeleton?
I like to think of it as a thin veneer of living organism on top of what is the skeleton. So as the coral grows, the reason why it grows and creates these annual bands and grows upward in the water to begin with is that actually has a symbiotic algae that live in its tissue that give it much of its energy. So it needs to be close to the light. So through time, it grows up and up and up and up in the water column, basically chasing that sunlight. And so the organism itself just lives on the very, very surface of the reef. And underneath it is that history book. And so this is why we call corals and trees and other types of records like this natural historians, because they are in that skeleton that it leaves behind as it grows through the water column. Just like the history book in the library, they're recording information about the ocean conditions that were hundreds or even, depending on how old the coral is, thousands of years in the past.
Have there been surprises in the things that you have found out in your studies?
Yeah, so one of the big surprises for this study was we really understand really well from these nature's historians, from trees, from corals, from ice cores we haven't talked about yet, other types of records, how temperatures have varied on the last few thousand or even hundreds of thousands of years. But the water cycle is harder to pin down. You can imagine, thinking about the weather on a day-to-day basis, whether it's going to rain or not is highly dynamic. It's a very chaotic system, right? It might even rain in one part of Tucson and not a couple blocks down the road, right? So understanding changes in the water cycle with climate change is much more complicated. And so what's really exciting about this particular study that we're talking about today is that we're able to, for the first time, bring together my coral records and my colleagues' coral records, along with other types of these natural archives, so tree rings, lake sediments, marine sediments, and ice cores, and basically show that the water cycle responds very quickly to any changes in global temperature. And this is something that's been shown for the first time in our work.
Can you give an example of how the water cycle responds to a change in temperature? Temperature goes up, what happens?
Yeah, so temperature goes up and it basically creates more energy in the system for to move these, like we talked about, heavier isotopes, these water isotopes, through the climate system. And so we can track these using these natural proxies. And so this means really we're adding more vigor to the water cycle with warming.
Let me kind of go back to one, when we were talking about isotopes. Could you give like one example of, you will get heavier oxygen isotopes when something happens? I mean, some process that drives it one direction or another.
Yeah, one of the main ways we know is when water is actually evaporating off the surface of the ocean. So it takes energy for that process to happen. And that's ultimately where much of the rainfall comes from, right? It's from the surface of the ocean evaporating, being transported through the atmosphere, and eventually here in Tucson, desert Southwest, falling out as rain. That process, again, requires energy from the sun ultimately. And it takes more energy the heavier the water molecule is, as you would imagine, than if it's lighter. And so under warmer climates, you can get more and more of these heavier versions of the water molecule evaporated off the water surface and falling down as rain here in Tucson, Arizona. And so what we're able to show is using tree rings from here in the Southwest, as well as my coral records from the tropical Pacific, that we see signatures that during this warmer climate that we're seeing today, there's a lot more of these heavier water isotopes being recorded than there is during the cooler climates of the last 2,000 years.
Diane, how does an expert on coral reefs end up at a university in the desert?
It's a great question. I get asked a lot by my family. No, I'm just kidding. So we have one of the best climate programs in general that I can think of in the U.S. and in the world. We have a fantastic climate program. And so a big part of that is the impact of climate change on our oceans. And so even though we're here in the desert Southwest, I'd argue that we are leaders in thinking about not just the way the tropical oceans are changing, but how they're impacting really vulnerable ecosystems like coral reefs. And one of the ways we can do that is using the unique Biosphere 2 ocean ecosystem, which is the largest enclosed mesocosm in the world, which is dedicated to reef research.
And how did you personally get interested in coral reefs, or did you get started with your interest in climate?
Great question. No, I came to climate from my interest in corals. So I was fortunate in that when I was young, I was the youngest of 4, and I grew up in Minnesota, and my parents were pretty readily sick of the winters by the time I was a kid. And so we traveled to the Caribbean a few times when I was really young, and had a very set of formative experiences snorkeling when I was 8, 9, 10 years old in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I think one can, especially a science nerd like myself, not really go through an experience like that and not be captivated by the reefs. So indeed I was, and ever since then, I think the writing was on the wall. I became a marine scientist, and then I realized that in order to understand how reefs will survive with ocean change, we really need to develop better understanding of how, where, and why oceans are changing. And that's why I now poke holes in coral reefs to understand climate change itself, so that we can really understand these really dynamic changes that are happening on coral reefs worldwide.
What's the bottom line for climate of the Southwest?
One of the things that we found in our study is that the Pacific Ocean, as you can imagine, is a massive ocean basin. It really impacts climate here in the Southwest. And our work using these natural archives across the world showed that really the availability of water here in the Southwest is strongly connected to what the Pacific is doing. And so this shows that we really need to look to the Pacific for answers for our water availability into the future.
And as the Pacific is warming up, what does that say for our water availability?
That is the main focus of my lab's work. And what I can say is we're finding that these big, intense events that we call El Niño events that tend to bring wetter weather here to Arizona are likely becoming stronger and more intense with climate change. But the jury is still out, so stay tuned for more work from my group on that.
And we need it.
Thanks for coming in, Diane.
Yeah.
And good luck with your research.
Thank you.
Our guest today has been Diane Thompson, an expert in corals. This is Tim Swindle, and you have been listening to Arizona Science. You can also listen to this and other Arizona Science segments by going to the AZPM website at azpm.org.